Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Rouxbe live event. My name is Chef Ken Rubin, and we are here today for open office hours. Open office hours here at Rouxbe really tend to include questions from lots of different areas of content and lots of different courses, including our plant-based course offerings, as well as our non-plant-based course offerings. And really anything goes, anything under the sun in terms of culinary, food and cooking, troubleshooting recipes, sourcing or finding inspiration, anything like that will be appropriate for today's office hours. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive right in. If you're new to office hours and have never joined us before, real quickly to ask a question, all you need to do is type in your question to the top right next to where you see me speaking. Click that black add button to moderate it for the back end so we can have a quick look at it before we publish it. And otherwise, when you see a question that you like, click on that little heart next to it. That will pop it up a little bit higher so we get to it just a bit faster. So again, anything goes in terms of questions. If we didn't have an opportunity to fully answer your question today, or if your question is maybe more personal, we might defer and have you contact us directly as well. We definitely want to help you and answer your questions, but also want to be aware that we're in a public forum here as well. So the first question that we have here is about vegetable stock. How would you adjust the vegetable stock recipe to make in the Instant Pot? Is there a general rule of thumb for adjusting stove top cook time for Instant Pot or pressure cooker? Great question. So I'm a huge fan of using the Instant Pot for lots of different things, but I think that the application of making vegetable stock in particular works really, really well. Number one, it reduces the amount of time considerably to produce a flavorful vegetable broth or vegetable stock. You know, you can spend anywhere between, say, an hour to 3 hours in a conventional stovetop simmering type scenario to get a nice richly covered veggie stock. I would say in a pressure cooker you can do it in 15 to 20 minutes pretty easily, knowing that you have some ramp up time where you're building pressure and some cool down time and things like that. But your active cooking time can just be a fraction of what that time might ordinarily be. In terms of ratios and things like this, I don't really have standard ratios. I think it kind of depends on how much you're cooking and what you're cooking, how starchy it is, or how much absorption you might need in terms of if you're cooking beans or grains versus that extractive quality of doing something like a pressure cooked vegetable broth. But I would say generally the best thing to do is give it a good try. And if you find that your stock is just not very flavorful, that your vegetables aren't really soft, that more extraction can happen, then make that mental note that that if you've got 5 quarts of water and a good amount of vegetables, that maybe instead of 15 minutes you go at 20 minutes or 25 minutes. But I would say that's probably your sweet spot in terms of veggie stock or veggie broth. Somewhere in that 15 to 25 minute should be plenty. You're going to get a lot of extraction, a lot of great flavors. One other reason why I like pressure cooking, not just from the time-saving perspective, but really from the perspective of the maintenance or the retention of all those amazing flavors. So part of the great thing about pressure cooking is you're locking in a lot of the aromatics and things that are volatile compounds that give the food flavor itself. And by not letting those just escape freely into the air with all the steam and all that, kind of the effect of simmering open, by maintaining that, by keeping that closed, you're actually keeping more of those aromatic qualities inside the pot versus escaping. And of course, it makes your house smell great and all your neighbors know that you're making soup, but there are limited numbers of those volatile compounds, and the more that stay in your food, the more flavorful your food will be. So hopefully that's helpful there for you. Next question from Lynn here is about tofu. I know tofu gets a bad rap in a lot of ways, but still one of my very favorite Very protein-rich plant-based foods. Obviously has an amazing tradition going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I'm a big fan of tofu. It is important, however, as this question notes, to treat your tofu properly so you get the most out of it. So the question is about firm versus extra firm tofu. What is the basic difference between the amount of water? Lynn always uses a tofu press for 20 to 30 minutes before preparing. Does it really matter if I use firm or extra firm? I would say, Lynn, the biggest factor in your success in being able to execute a tofu recipe well, I would say has more to do with the draining and the pressing that you're doing. I think 20 to 30 minutes is perfect for your tofu to just give it that that extra ability to slough off some of that water so that you have just a denser, less moist product. Ultimately, it's going to help with how you marinate. It's going to help with the effect of cooking in terms of browning and things like this. I would say between firm and extra firm, a lot of it's going to be very brand specific. I would say extra firm will have just slightly less moisture, maybe a slightly increased amount of relative protein by weight, only because you have less weight occupied by water and more weight occupied by solids, just a slight density kind of issue. Otherwise, very little difference. I would say if you go from soft tofu to extra firm, certainly a big difference. But if you go from firm to extra firm in many brands, you might not even notice much of a difference. But certainly pressing is going to be your best bet. That's going to be the thing that I think increases the ability to get bolder, more concentrated flavor, as well as, like I said earlier, the ability to have browning and texture and things enhanced because of the amount of less water that you have in there, let's just say. John O asks, what are the pitfalls of learning online? Well, John, I would say that there are pitfalls to learning online. Certainly a lot of those pitfalls would be very similar to any kind of learning. But things that might be specific to online, I think, have a lot to do with people's sense of connection to their learning. If you're in a conventional classroom and you're showing up 2 days a week, there's a social aspect of that where there's some expectations created about showing up and participating and engaging and being part of the voice. I think in an online environment, because we don't have that physicality, we don't have the welcoming you to the classroom in that physical sense feeling. It's a little bit different in terms of how you engage, how you create that baseline for managing expectations, understanding that dynamic, that kind of fluid dynamic that exists between instructors and students. I would also say one of the big things is, within online, getting help and not feeling like you're on your own or by yourself. So it's one of the things that we try to spend a lot of time on at Rouxbe is within a course scenario. If you need help, we try to create lots of different modes of access points so that you don't feel like you're on your own. We want our online experiences at Rouxbe to really find that right balance between honoring and respecting your independence and your self-directed learning, but also provide all those mechanisms so that when you need help, we're here for you. And you don't have to spend a lot of time or attention or your own kind of stress level to get what you need from us. I'd say besides that, the online learning piece really, I think, is important from a kind of holding yourself to account perspective. Like, did you really do the things that you set out to do? And a lot of those things are going to be internally motivated, internally driven, knowing that you're doing it for the right reasons. So, driving yourself to certain outcomes or certain competencies, or really knowing that you have that knowledge basis versus just going through the motions. Again, that's endemic in any kind of learning, but going through the motions and just saying, well, I spent the time, but I didn't really learn it. It's good enough. That's not going to be good enough from a competency, being able to perform or demonstrate the activity kind of perspective. It's like, at the end of the day, for cooking, you can either do it well or not. And if you can't do it well, then it's time to do some practice. Next question here from Peggy. Peggy says, please tell us about your food anthropology background. What's the oldest food you've seen? Also glad to see Wegmans on the list. I'm in Rochester with a little grocery store in the corner. Where I grew up was Wegmans. Now it's a tourist attractive. So Peggy, first off, Wegmans has been just a phenomenal partner of ours. They do amazing work in all the communities that they operate in. They also support us with one of our nonprofit partners called FoodLink, which is also in Rochester. So can't say enough great things about the team at Wegmans, their leadership, their ability to really, walk the walk when it comes to honoring the employees and to build programs for learning. In terms of my work in food anthropology, most of my work, I would say, within food anthropology is in the social cultural realm. So we're dealing with living, breathing cultures, dynamic cultures, and their foods. I have done some food archaeology, which is really more about uncovering the history of food, the kind of long tail of history. So I have done a little bit of archaeology, and I've seen some old food specimens, primarily in Mexico, where I was doing some work in the Yucatan. But a lot of my work really focuses on people and their food today as a social anthropologist. And really my interest in that world came because as a young person, I was reading a lot of cookbooks. I was collecting cookbooks from all around the world, and I became just really interested in why different foods existed in different forms, why certain ingredients were very prevalent or common in some areas and didn't exist in others, and why we saw common ingredients even across cultures, why you find some really interesting flavor sets, say in Vietnam and in Mexico, that are very similar, but that result in much, much different cuisines. So these sorts of questions were of interest to me as an anthropologist. I was fascinated by the stories people tell about food and the ability for food to really be that main pillar through which we understood culture. So those were kind of some of the things that I was interested in when it came to food and food anthropology. Laura's asking, I'm trying to make baked plantain chips. They always come out chewy or burnt instead of light and crispy. Do you have any ideas? Gosh, Laura, I would say that one of the things around plantains is they do well with kind of a two-tier or a secondary cooking process. So one process to bring the starches to the surface and soften, and another process to create that crispiness. So you might find that that soaking sliced plantain chips, let's call them, very thinly sliced plantain, soaking those in some water or in some hot water even to help with those starches might be a good first step. You might think about the cooking temperature. If you're doing something in the oven with a Portland or with a plantain chip, and that is getting not really crispy, it's getting kind of hard and dry. Just think about temperature. Think about what you can do to get to that crispy point so you're not burning and you're not soggy. It's something in between there. You might also consider cooking on a perforated pan so you get a little bit more airflow around it. You're really just trying to find a way to wick moisture without creating too much direct heat. So time and temperature is going to be your friend. If you do use a little bit of oil, that might help with wicking some of that moisture and also with some of that texture. Next question here is from Alexandra. She says, hello, I'd like to know if you have any advice on how to start a plant-based chef career after the professional plant-based certification. So great question. We get this question a lot in terms of what do I do after I graduate from Rouxbe? What are the options? What pathways exist that you could recommend? I would say for many people, unless you already have a background as a chef and you've done a lot of work in the food space, your completion of certification is going to be the entry point for getting started. It wouldn't make you a chef right out of the gates, certainly. It's going to give you the the basis or the means to start on that pathway. So I would say if you're looking at, kind of what those first steps are, how to turn that completion of a certification program into something professionally more meaningful, I'd say the very first thing to do is, look at your ability to work in that space, whether it's at a restaurant, and we know during the pandemic that a lot of restaurants are really struggling and or completely changing their model. Or what are those other avenues? What are those mechanisms that you can still cook and be productive and use those skills, but have a clientele, have an audience? Maybe that's small kind of meal kit delivery. Maybe it's cooking classes via Zoom. Maybe it's volunteer work. Maybe it's some other thing. But I would say for a lot of our plant-based graduates, it's really piecing together a few different things. They might start by maybe helping someone with some like menu development, some recipes, from thinking through some new menu that has some plant-based items on it. It could also be that you're doing some meal kits, maybe with a hospital. You're doing some classes. It's a connection to the space and finding where you're going to thrive, where you're going to do your best work and contribute the most. There's no real singular path in this space. We do definitely see that people, especially people who bring some other professional experience, are piecing it together using the professional skills that they had in this other context. They're, kind of bringing in those other talents, the other expertise that they have in that way. Next question here. When cooking veggie broth, is it best to leave it plain and allow the recipe to dictate the spices used? Or is it okay to go ahead and add spices? So far, all I do is cook in the Instant Pot for 30 minutes, add a couple of tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. Yeah, so if you're just pressure cooking your veggies, 30 minutes should be plenty to get a good extraction. Again, depending on how small those are cut up, or how much pressure you're using in that pressure cooker, that should be plenty. I tend to leave my veggie broths pretty plain. I would say I make lots of different kinds. I make like a classic, mirepoix style. I do a veggie broth that's very tomato heavy. I do one that's very mushroom heavy. But I would say within each kind of category, leaving them as plain as you can will give you the flexibility within the recipe context to do a lot more. So just as an example, if I'm doing a mushroom-based veggie broth, and that's kind of the leaning direction is towards mushroom, if I know I'm going to use that for some Japanese soup recipe, I might amplify that closer to the time of making the soup with some seaweed or some additional mushrooms or some other flavors that kind of lean towards that direction. But if I'm going to use that mushroom broth for something where I'm making a mushroom risotto with oregano and other, kind of more resinous herbs, say rosemary, I don't want to go in that direction. I don't want to put in the ginger and the seaweed and other things. I'm going to want to keep it more towards the direction of, some of those more savory herbs, things like that. So it really kind of ultimately depends on what you're cooking and how much planning. Now, if you know that you're making all that stock for one soup recipe, and that soup is going to be, like a Japanese recipe with some ginger, then great. Just make it the way you want it. But if you're unclear, or you might divide up that recipe between, or that stock between multiple recipes, then you might want to be a little bit more tame in terms of what other flavors you add, just to keep it a little bit more neutral. And by the way, adding a little bit of vinegar, I would say, is going to be helpful for lifting the flavor, but also for extracting, I think, some of the, some of the greatness out of that stock. Sometimes the acid actually helps with some of the texture of the ultimate stock that you have, and, keeping vegetables really fresh tasting. So that's a great thing to note there. Rosalind asks, hi Ken, is there anywhere to gain more information on utilizing cooking scraps besides the obvious thing like using them in stocks? Are there resources that can teach cooks perhaps a bit more creative and inventive with them? Rosalind, it's a great line of thought. I think when I look back at my culinary career and I look back at things that I wish I did earlier. I spent a long time in the 90s and earlier part of the 2000s, really not thinking too much about maximizing kitchen products or minimizing food waste. And I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, it's become more important and more a part of my mind and my thinking. So I think this is an important area for anyone to really think about is what is the overall impact. Some of the things you reference, like scraps, work well in stocks and things like this. But I always encourage people when you're making stock, not just to depend on your scraps. You want to have lots of, completely, whole vegetables and things that you're working with, just because you need that much for the volume. You're never going to be able to make enough great stock with just scraps and things. But I would say, the other thing to think about there is, if you're not going to put it in the stock pot for the soup or the stock, what is it you're going to do? And I think that for lots of people, they think about things like, what are those other methods of preserving? When you're extracting into a stock, then you can preserve that stock as a liquid. You could freeze it. You could use it a lot of different ways. But what are the ways you could preserve those pieces? I go very, very quickly to pickling and fermenting. And by fermenting, I mean like a lacto fermentation, where you're just using the natural fermentation capacity from salted vegetables. So kind of old world, old style pickles versus, what we refer to today as pickling, which is just acidulating or acidifying foods with vinegar, right? So it's just another way to preserve, but still. So I would look at all those scraps being a great opportunity to make something like a salsa or something like a relish or a chutney or a very flavorful vegetable paste or puree that you could add to lots of different things. I would also think about those scraps potentially from a point of dehydration. All those little bits and pieces, if they're dehydrated and pulverized into, say, vegetable powders, those become very potent. They can be used to flavor or rehydrate things. They could be used to sprinkle into garnish. They could be used to add flavor to a dressing or to coat vegetables that we're roasting and all different kinds of things. I myself tend to look at all these different scraps and little bits and pieces kind of as a composite. There's certain things where I can very quickly take those scraps and just use them in stock, and I produce a lot of stock every week. There's other things that you go, wow, that's actually not a scrap. It's something that if I don't use it today, it's going to be too far gone. So how do I take this whole red pepper and do something with it? Maybe you put it on a burner and you char the outside and then you peel the skin and you use that flesh for something. So maybe it wouldn't have worked great fresh as crudité or fresh on a salad, but yeah, if you fire roast it, perfect. Or take it and find some way to use it and then freeze it, right? So you can roast off a bunch of vegetables that are maybe just on their way down, a little bit sad or sorry looking. Roast them up, use them as roasted vegetables, or puree them. Use it as a roasted vegetable puree. It makes a great addition to a sauce or something like that. So kind of sky's the limit, in terms of some of these things. I would say that, your ability to be creative and to say, well, what are all the different various ways to use this is going to be really, really important in terms of utilizing that product. Next question here is about cashew bechamel. So Lynn asks, when using the cashew bechamel as a base for risotto, what would this look like? I'm only used to using the traditional way of creating a risotto, which involves butter and oil, something of which I'd like to take out. So Lynn, the primary reason for adding the cashew sauce to the risotto is to really amp up that creaminess, that feeling of fattiness and that mouth-filling feeling that you get really in the combination of the starches from the risotto, from the rice, but also from the use of butter or oils that can really enrich the risotto, add to texture, add to flavor, and these sorts of things. So I would simply start the risotto in a very similar way as if you were using oil. You could do a dry saute or extended dry sweating process with your onions, your shallots, your aromatics. That can help build a nice base of flavor. Maybe you're developing a little bit of color there, maybe not, but that's a great way to kind of build sweetness and build flavor. When you have that going in the bottom of your pan, you can then add your arborio rice and do the same thing where you're kind of dry cooking that, toasting that rice, building some flavor that way. And then when you add your flavorful stock to that, you've got now your cooked aromatics, you've got your rice. That's going to quickly begin to release a lot of different starches and develop flavor and things like this. That's going to be delicious. Now, you're going to get plenty of starchiness just from that and from stirring. So you're going to have a nice creamy texture. But to amplify that, to really make it more mouth-filling and that kind of that richness, right? Instead of adding a big dollop of butter or drizzling olive oil in there, adding a small amount of cashew cream, this cashew bechamel, is going to be amazing. And when we say small amount, we really do mean small amount. A little will go a long way. So if you've got a batch of risotto, I would say a few tablespoons at the maximum is going to give you all that creaminess. And one thing you'll notice when you add that in is that unless you have a lot of liquid still very much surrounding all that rice, it's going to tighten up and bind up very, very quickly. Because when you heat up the cashew bechamel, the cashew cream, when you heat that up in the absence of enough liquid, it becomes very tight and it binds quickly. So just a little bit of a word of caution. You do want to make sure that you have some extra seasoned vegetable stock, or at the very least some water on hand, so that when you put it in, you don't just get this big, massive clumping of the cashew cream sauce with all the starchiness from your rice. You want to make sure that's nicely thinned out. Also knowing that as it cools, it's going to tighten up. So I always go a little bit on the loose side when it's blazing hot, knowing that when it steps back from the heat and goes through a cool down process, that those starches will begin to tighten up and gelatinize, and the fat from the cashew will do the same. And that's going to create a lot more tightness. That's why reheating risotto the next day is always a little bit of a challenge, because all those starches have had a chance to swell and then cool. And to get them to separate, you have to add some more liquid. Next question here. Can you tell us your opinion on soy? Is it safer if it's non-GMO? So Pamela, I'm not anti-soy. I think that, like anything, you have to moderate how much you eat of anything. I wouldn't want a person's singular source of plant-based beans or plant-based protein to be a soybean. But certainly I think soy works well as part of a larger, more diverse diet. It is, in terms of the amount of protein per calorie in terms of overall soybeans, very, very high on that list. So it does give you a lot of nutrient density compared to even other beans. It also is something that's been used in many Asian countries for thousands of years successfully without health issues. So I think when you talk about dangers of soy, a lot of it has to do with the overdependence or over-reliance on soy. My general perspective would always be, if you can find non-GMO or organic soy, even better. That's going to give you, I think, extra peace of mind just about the integrity of the origin of that product. But certainly I'm not anti-soy. I think it could be part of an overall diet that includes lots of different legumes and protein-rich sources. Next question here is from Helen. When baking a cake, what causes the center not to rise, but the outer portion does? Good question, Helen. I might direct you to, our customer service query line. student services at ruby.com. Fran Costigan, who runs our vegan desserts course, might have a little bit of insight here, but it sounds to me like your batter might be cooking in a pan that just might have too much batter, too much volume, too much mass. In other words, it's not cooking in a fast enough time where you're getting some parts of that batter to leaven and to rise and to create some aeration, but the center of it maybe is not getting hot enough and not creating that ability to have expansion of air and all those different characteristics. So it could be cooking time and temperature. It could be the vessel that you're cooking in. You might also want to check the quality or the integrity of whatever leavening you're using. If it's a baking powder or baking soda, just make sure it's fresh. These things do age out over time, and I have had a lot of different students say, gosh, the recipe called for a teaspoon of baking powder and it didn't do anything. So I would say, instead of doubling up on that, which might create some off flavors or some bitterness in your final recipe, I would say the better thing to do is just make sure you have, fresher product to work with. All those active chemicals in baking soda and baking powder, like I said, will age out over time, become a little bit less powerful, less potent. Next question here from Barbara. Hello, Chef Ken. I love this process. However, I admit that I'm struggling with knife skills. I'm afraid of the knife edge and getting cut. Well, Barbara, that is a very natural fear. I would say it's a healthy fear. It's a fear we don't want you to lose, is the understanding that the knife can be very dangerous. It can cut you. It's a good thing to always remember, but I don't want it to be a barrier for you. I want you to feel confident and like you have control over your knife. We want you to be guiding your own destiny and not feeling like the knife is controlling you. So I think first things first is making sure that the knife that you're holding, the knife that you're using, is really the right knife for you. If it's not the right knife, it's too heavy, the handle doesn't fit well in your hand, if it seems out of balance, if it's hard to sharpen, all these things would be good indications that you might, look at another type of knife. As long as your knife fits well, is comfortable, and is really sharp, that's going to make the process of learning to cut so much easier, so much better. So let's just get that one set of questions out of the way right out of the gates. Let's make sure it's the right knife, that it fits well in your hand. It's gonna work well for you. Once you get over that hurdle, I think the other message around knife skills is, kind of twofold. Number one, you can't just do it once and expect your knife skills to be great. You have to really practice over and over and over again, and it's not hard work. It's not something that you can't not achieve with some practice. You can attain those goals with time and with some commitment, but these are not hard things to replicate, right? We're not doing brain surgery. We're just holding a knife and cutting up an onion and getting comfortable with the fluidity, the motion. It doesn't need to be super precise. It doesn't need to be done very quickly. So just slow down and think about the things you can control. I would say from there, you'll begin to develop maybe some of your own techniques for how you hold your body or what feels good, how much cutting you can do before you get fatigued or before you get frustrated. And all those things will really factor in to your knife skills. So I always suggest, start with just this mindset of, if you're going to cut one or two things in a day, some onions and some celery, let's say, just take a deep breath, focus on that specific activity of cutting, being very mindful every time your knife has some placement of where that knife is, how straight it is, the positioning of your arm and your body and your shoulder. Just kind of think about it for just a little bit. Again, we don't want to make it something you have to become obsessed over, but I have found that sometimes just giving people the instructions of while you're cutting having that little bit of extra awareness of how your body feels or how open your body is. So many people cut and they are hunched over the cutting board. Their body's very awkward. They're leaning over. Their body's basically horizontal. It's just really hard to work that way for more than just a few seconds. So just kind of relax, stand up, let the knife do the work for you. Those are going to be really, really important things. Next question here. I can neither do tofu nor tempeh because of the soy and thyroid problems. What can I use to gain the same texture? I am not totally plant-based, but willing to utilize better food choices. So, Vanessa, it's a great question. I think that ultimately it really depends on the application. There's going to be some recipes that use tofu kind of for the texture, with like a crispiness or a pronounced texture, something that has some chew. Other times when tofu is pureed or put into a blend that makes it so you can't discern the texture. Certainly with tempeh, that's all about texture and finding the right balance between texture and the flavor. Sometimes at tempeh, it's about offsetting some of the natural bitterness that comes through the production process. But I would say, some things to consider just in terms of these things is, there's lots of other beans to use. If you're thinking about, say, tempeh in particular, you can make tempeh from black beans or from chickpeas, or buy tempeh from black beans or from chickpeas. So let's not rule out tempeh. It's not all soy, so that's an important thing. The other thing I'll just mention is there's just so many other great things to eat out there without having to get hung up on the protein, the particular protein density of those foods. Knowing that lots of other beans and lots of other vegetables are going to have lots of great protein, lots of great flavor, texture, attributes. That's just a great overall way to go. I always surprise people when I do, tacos or something that are maybe primarily lentils, but then I've got some, finely kind of crushed up tempeh in there too, some little extra texture, or some finely soaked in chopped walnuts or something like that. Even can add a lot of interesting texture to a dish. So, think about this as your overall toolkit. What are the things that you can pull from that toolkit? So when you're making a dish and you're lacking some crunch or lacking some smoothness, what do you do to add that component? Next question from Darlene. What is the healthiest olive oil to purchase? So Darlene, if you use oil in your diet, not all of our students here at Rouxbe include oil. In particular, many of our Forks Over Knife students don't include oil. But if you wanted to include a quality olive oil, my suggestion would be really find something that will be very much in that area of extra virgin olive oil, fresh for the season, something that will be very low acid, and it ultimately fits the flavor profile for the type of oil that you like. There's oils that are very fruity. There's oils that kind of have a pepperiness. There's oils that are very grassy. So it just depends on the flavor profile, the spectrum that you're going for. And other than that, I think just buying quality oil that's nice and fresh is going to be your best bet. Cricket asks, hello, I want to become a whole food plant-based chef and educator. What steps would you recommend? I'm taking the plant-based 3-month course, and we'll sign up for the plant-based 6-month course in August. I'm also considering the Institute of Culinary Education in New York. So yeah, I would say great. You've got a lot of different awesome education options in front of you. One of the great things right now about living today is that you've got online options, on-ground options potentially with employers for being mentored by people. I would say, Cricket, the biggest thing for you is really looking inside yourself and understanding what's motivating you, what's driving you. And only you can answer the question of what does success look like? What does it look like when you've reached that next step where you have a pivot to make, where you can have some impact? We at Rouxbe really believe so much in this idea of multiple outcomes, that all of our students are unique and that each one of them will have some outcomes very specific to their work, to their motivation, to their drive, to their timeline, and all these sorts of things. So if you're really driven, it sounds like you are, I would just say sky's the limit. Do all the things that you can do that fits within your time and your budget and your style that's going to advance you. Another thing I'll say is that once you start working in the field of whole food plant-based, you'll also very quickly realize that there are amazing opportunities to learn and grow and hone your skills through the application of your knowledge. So that's also really, really exciting, knowing that, no matter what formal instruction you receive, there's always going to be more waiting for you. When I prepare nut milk, sometimes they taste like the cloth I use for straining, like soap. How should I clean the cloth for not affecting the taste? Well, oh gosh, so certainly, Sarah, if you are using, any sort of a cloth or anything like that you're using for straining nut milks and things, by all means, you want to make sure that is very, very, very well rinsed, that there's no residues or remnants of soap. So really, if you were to wash that with soap, I would rinse it really well in an abundance of warm water at least once after that, just to make sure that there's no traces of soap that might impact the final flavor. I have had people complain about kind of that cloth flavor, let's say, not so much the soapy flavor, but the cloth flavor that the cloth itself has imparted. And that usually comes in cases where maybe it's the first time that you're using it and you maybe moisten the cloth, but it hasn't been washed yet. So always a good idea before you do anything, wash the cloth, make sure you rinse it well, and then it's a good time to begin to use it. There are other things I might say that, if the soap that you're using is just not easily rinsed, you might forego using soap at all. And if those nuts come out, out of that bag and there's some little pieces, you maybe just let it air dry and just sort of tap it out and don't worry so much about the formal soap and washing process. Take care of all that. I'd rather have a scenario where you're able to just dry and kind of sterilize it versus adding soap necessarily. So sterilization would mean you would just put that into water that's 180 degrees or higher versus having any detergent or soap like that in that water. Elizabeth asks, what is the difference between the general membership courses and the 6-month professional course? Same videos. How are they different? So they're very, very different. The membership is really giving people access to a lesson gallery and a gallery of short courses that have different engagement and different assessment models. They're not all plant-based. There are a few that are plant-based, but really they're much, much different models. If you look online at our membership offerings, it has a pretty clear delineation of what's included there. So the 6-month course is a lot more professional in nature. It definitely has some of the same videos, but all contextualized in a much different package with activities and assignments and assessments and a whole different way of learning and some different expectations. But certainly there's some of the same content. You'll see using a knife or how to make salad dressing or roasting vegetables and these things. Again, it's all how it's packaged within that learning pathway. Next question here. Will you guys offer an associate's degree in the future? Oh, great question. It's something that we have been talking about internally for quite some time. There are many people here on the Rouxbe team who came out of that more conventional culinary school background where we were operating or running schools that did have certificate programs and associate's degrees, in some cases bachelor's degrees. So it's something that we definitely give a lot of thought to. It's something that I know our students are interested in and looking for. So I would say stay tuned. I think as we continually go down this path where Rouxbe is becoming more and more a leader in the online space and more able to serve a wide variety of constituents and learner styles, something that absolutely we're very, very interested in. Ariane asks, why is it when I cook fresh mussels, sometimes they open up drastically and fall apart? Gosh, I'm not sure. It sounds like, one of two things. One would be, if the mussels aren't really pristine and really, really fresh, there might be a tendency for some of their hinges and the adductor muscle that's, using it to open and close might not be quite as strong. And if that flops open, maybe it just feels a little bit flimsy. Otherwise, I would just say, just being cognizant of cooking times. Once those mussels or any bivalve, pops open because of that change in muscle structure, that's a good sign that it's cooked. You don't have to keep going past that and risk, degrading that protein or having it fall apart. Next question here. I taught myself how to drink black coffee, but realized I have to have a good quality coffee and good water. Are there any tips you can tell me on how to eat that way without all the oils and salts and creams that I've been covering my food for a decade? Well, Pan, I think your observation about the quality of the base ingredient is really, really important. That, I think, is probably the first place I'll start in terms of, giving you some tips that might help you move away from heavier foods that, if you put butter and a bunch of salt on something, that's going to taste a certain way, and that's very, very predictable. So what are those things that you can do where you're wanting to build flavor with quality ingredients? And I would say, going back to the quality of the produce, the integrity of that product in the first place is going to make all the difference. So you'll find a much, much reduced need or desire to mask or cover or, overlay lots of different flavors onto food that already tastes really, really good. And, one thing that you might notice if you have the ability to shop at a farmer's market, or if your local supermarket even has like a local food section where they spend a little bit of extra time or attention sourcing something more locally, even within, say, 100 miles or 200 miles, right? Better than from across the country or across the ocean. Begin to notice, choose those foods, number one, and then begin to notice how maybe that broccoli tastes that's from the farmer's market versus the broccoli that might have sat in cold storage for a few weeks. See what it tastes like. You'll notice very quickly that the quality, the integrity, the ability for produce to have interesting flavors depends so much on how old it is, how it was handled, how it was treated in the process, and all these sorts of things. So, like you said, quality coffee beans, quality water. Well, start with quality tomatoes, quality broccoli, quality cabbage. All those things will make your food taste so much better just right out of the gates, so that you can begin to apply, more minimal seasoning, less salt, less oil, no oil, and building flavor with herbs and spices and acids and vinegars and reductions. That's going to be a lot more rewarding for you than kind of the heaviness of the covering up of your food. If anything, there's a certain lightness that you get when you move into that realm of the fresh and the fresh herbs and the acids and those sorts of things. To me, that's just super, super exciting. Once you put something heavy on your food, it does have a tendency to coat your mouth, kind of gum up your palate sometimes even, and you just want to have a lightness. A green vegetable with some bitterness to kind of cut through that goes a very, very long way. Beth asks, what suggestions do you have on helping children become more interested in plant-based foods? Uh, you know, I've given this a lot of thought. I have 2 kids myself, and growing up in our household, they've had a ton of exposure, obviously, to eating a lot of different types of foods. Of course, lots of different plant-based foods, and we have the luxury here where I live in Portland, Oregon, of having just world-class farmers markets. I also keep a garden and grow my food. But my 2 main suggestions for engaging kids would be really to involve them with the process. So kind of big picture, if you have the ability to grow anything, even just some basil, some parsley, if you have the ability to grow anything, then do it. Getting your kids to a point, where they can feel a sense of having participated in something as simple as putting some basil seeds in the pot and adding some water, waiting a few weeks for that to turn into a little plant. And that first moment where they pick that basil leaf off that plant and go, wow, that was just a tiny little black seed in some water in the soil. Now that tastes amazing. I want to put that onto a salad with tomatoes and red onions. And amazing, right? That's just going to be a beautiful flavor. So it's that point of involvement that kids go, wow, that was like magic. That really transformed something. So engaging them with that process of planting the food, harvesting the food, of course, cooking the food, anything that you can do. I start really easy with my kids. Hey, can you peel this garlic? Can you take the ends off this onion? Can you count out 5 carrots from this big bag of carrots? Whatever it is, there's always a way for to get the kids involved. The second big thing that I do, and it really informed my kids' ability for them to exercise their own personality, their own individualism, versus me saying, hey family, here's dinner, and I'm going to make you plates, and everyone is getting, broccoli and lentils and rice and salad and whatever else on the plate, and that's it. That's dinner. Instead of taking that approach, when my kids were fairly young, I started taking the approach of, hey, we're going to have 4, 5, 6 things on the table, and you choose. You decide. You just want to load your plate full of broccoli, but you're making that decision because you like it. That's okay. I don't have my feelings hurt. I know that there's 3 or 4 things that I cook that you're not eating, but great. If you're going for the broccoli and you want to have seconds of that, amazing. Because at that point, at that moment, they're exercising their own self-determination. They're making a decision. I'm not making it for them. I'm not saying, hey, you love broccoli, eat more broccoli. They're saying, that broccoli tasted good. I like that more than the other 4 things. I'm going to decide to put more of that on my plate. And even as a very young person, that sense of feeling empowered and to have a choice and to have your choices also be good choices is great. So I started doing that pretty early in my kids' lives, where they get to pick and choose, and maybe their plate doesn't have all 5 or 6 things, but it's got 2 or 3 on it. But they're things that they tend to be happier with. They're not complaining because I didn't put it on their plate. I didn't impose on them. I'm not the one who put it on their plate and then set the expectation that they have to eat it all. When they chose, even if it's something that they wouldn't necessarily go for, but they chose it as something curious, it's just a much different frame for them. Next question that we have here. Looks like a few questions in one. First part of the question, I should say, is there a secret to cooking a perfect omelette? If so, what? So let's deal with that one first there. I would say when it comes to cooking an omelet or really cooking anything, it's just going to come down to practice. There is a technique with omelet making where you really want to moderate the temperature so that the eggs aren't cooking too quickly. You're not adding too much color at the bottom of the pan. Back when I was a restaurant cook, that was one of the things we always had to do, which is time and time again for breakfast is omelet, 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 omelet. It was always this, race between doing it quickly and efficiently without having coloration on that omelet, not browning and that sort of a thing. So I would say, finding the right pan temperature, having that finesse to get the omelet out of the pan, those are going to be really important things. More than anything, it just requires some practice, just like anything else. Omelet in particular, because of the shape and the folding, you might want to practice it a little bit differently. But a lot of that stuff just comes with doing it a few times. Next question, what is roux? So roux is technically just a combination of fat and starch, typically butter and flour, used for thickening. So roux is a kind of an all-purpose thickener used in sauces or soups or to finish things. It's something very transformational, and that was the basis of the name Rouxbe. And the third question is, can I give extra virgin olive oil a higher smoke point by mixing it with vegetable oil? You could, but you would be diminishing the flavor and the inherent quality of that oil. So you might just want to try, if you're going to do some sauteing, you might want to try either a gentler type saute or saute in another oil and then finish with the olive oil if it's the flavor that you want. So I would just, tend to be a little bit more delicate and mindful of the temperature of that oil, given that olive oil does have a lot of properties that will degrade if it's heated too much. Next question here. Hello, chef. How to make gnocchi? Another question, please. Neapolitan pizza. No matter the type of flour I use, either 00 or all-purpose, it never had the soft crust. It would bubble and wouldn't stretch the dough. So first of all, gnocchi, we have an amazing gnocchi recipe or multiple gnocchi recipes on Rouxbe. That's primarily bound together with the starch of a potato with just enough flour, a sweet potato with just enough flour to hold it together so it can roll off a paddle. So it's really very, very delicate. You want to make sure that those gnocchi are like little pillows so that you're not handling them too much. You're not developing gluten as you add flour into that that cooked potato. And really, so much of the key to good gnocchi is not over handling it and only touching it enough, from the point of shaping it, cooking it, and then saucing it. So it just basically holds together. Too much agitation, too much cooking time, too much handling of the gnocchi generally will cause it to break apart or be gummy or have excess of starches kind of coming off that product. When it comes to your pizza, I would say, it sounds like you're not hydrating your dough enough. If it's not bubbling and stretching and, kind of doing all those things, it's likely an issue around hydration or how long it's proofing for. You really want to make sure that when you're making dough and you give it that proof and then you're stretching dough, that you're not, using a aggressive rolling pin and flattening it out. If you do, you want to let it sit some more and let it re-proof and then stretch some more. But otherwise, I think it's just a matter of hydration. A dough is not going to get those nice big air pockets if it doesn't have enough moisture to create those big, kind of wafts of steam to create the structure when you have that leavening action. So because of the yeast and all the things happening in that dough, you've got gas being created. If the dough's too tight, not moist enough, that gas is going to have a really, really hard time making those bubbles. And then again, you're not going to have enough moisture to keep it full of steam as it cooks to create those big cooked air pockets. So hopefully that helps. I would just say, try doing a looser dough and seeing how little flour you can put on it before you start cooking. And then also very, very hot oven. I cook on a pizza stone at 500 degrees. I let that stone get hot for a minimum of 15 minutes on the bottom rack. All these sorts of things just really, really help. Question here. I have a question regarding which membership to select as an instructor, ? If you could reach out to our customer service team, they're going to be able to, in a much more direct and personal way, understand who you are and what your needs are. I think that's probably the best bet for you in terms of getting you all set up. Next question here. Hi, and thank you for the question opportunity. My question actually is how to recruit staff strong in plant-based skills. Is there a platform for those looking for jobs with this direction? What's your advice on how to test skills on interviews? So yeah, great question. I think in terms of job boards and things like this, there's a lot of people out there who are in plant-based, specializing in plant-based, looking for jobs. If you go into areas like LinkedIn and things, you'll see people who are, labeling themselves as plant-based or whole foods plant-based chefs. And these things are going to become important if you're looking for certain skills. In terms of testing skills, in terms of interviews, this is a tough thing. In the old world, we'd have people come into your restaurant and spend a day or two, doing kind of a practice, a paid trial or a stage or something, just to kind of see, hey, is this a good fit? Not just for them, but for you. Is this a good person you want to work with? It's just that kind of give and take to see if it's a good place. A lot of people in plant-based really want a mentor. They want a person who can help them and help facilitate additional learning and growth. Not all environments, not all restaurants, not all food businesses will do that. So you just want to make sure it's a good match. In terms of like matchmaking plant-based chefs and not, I would say a lot of the conventional services probably go in that direction, but certainly more can be done to create those direct matches. So great question there. Next question from Joy. What is the difference between Forks Over Knives plant-based cooking class and the professional chef class beyond additional topics? It appears the syllabus is very similar. Would the common topics be a duplicate? Yeah, Joy, so some of the topics in the plant-based professional versus Forks Over Knives will be duplicated. But in terms of the professional orientation, we're testing at a different level. We are looking for different ultimate outcomes in professional that are more about employability skills versus lifestyle behavior type things. So yeah, while we might show the same knife skills videos, we're going to ask you to do different things or have a different way of talking to you about their performance measure or the competency expectation in those different activities. So, the main difference between those is one is very professionally oriented and leaning, and one is really more about individual health support and lifestyle. Sarah has a question. Please share with us the best books you know more about mushrooms. Well, gosh, there are so many mushroom books. No titles come to mind specifically. There's some academic books on mushrooms that I've read throughout the years. But yeah, nothing really jumps to mind specifically in terms of titles. Sarah, if you do want to reach out to us specifically, I'm sure that some of my faculty members and some others in the team might have a mushroom book title jump straight to mind, but nothing is coming into my head right now immediately. What I'll say is that when you look at mushroom books or mushroom recipes, there is so much right now, so much interest in mushrooms and in around looking at mushrooms as a superfood, a great way to have texture and flavor and, just interest in cooking. I'll say that one of the most amazing frontiers in the plant-based food space or just the food space period, I think happens to be in mushrooms right now. So it's one of those areas that I think that people are, kind of looking at the mushroom as this amazing resource for flavor, for texture, for umami, something that's a standalone as well as added into other ingredients. Next question here from Sarah. When you're mostly vegan, how do you plan food combinations that are appealing and satisfying? Sarah, so these principles I'll share with you, I think apply no matter what kind of food you like. I would say if you're eating more whole food plant-based, certainly it gives you the platform and the reason to include a lot more diversity in your diet. But I would say the things that we're going for in terms of creating appealing and satisfying and balanced meals, those things apply to any style of eating. The big thing for me, And I've shared a little bit about this on this live event already, but the big thing for me is really about options and diversity and giving people what feels like an amazingly abundant, rich, attractive, colorful set of options to choose from. If you put that on the table and people show up who are expecting meat or not meat or whatever, and they arrive at a table where they have hot food and cold food and food that's crispy and food that's soft and food that's, you can eat with your hands and food that you're going to eat out of a bowl and, food of all different colors and things, that's what's exciting. That's when people go, wow, I'm looking at this huge array of things. Of course, I'm going to find something that I'm going to like. There's so much diversity. And that's really the biggest thing. People get satisfied when they can have maybe lots of different flavors that they've never had, or they can find 5 or 6 things that they like, but really one that they want to eat the most of. And that's just giving people options. It's giving people the ability to share and taste different things, and then, to make up their mind on their own. I think that one thing I've always learned about eating is I might be eating one thing on one day and really craving that flavor, that crunch or that spice or that heat or those chilies or the cinnamon and the warmth from that. Like, I might really crave that one day, and then the next day or the next week, maybe not. So it's not just because I love something on one day, I want to eat it all the time. So giving people the right options, the right combinations is going to help people feel more free. I think batch cooking has a lot to do with this, and setting yourself up so that you're not like, oh gosh, I'm on day 7 of eating black bean soup. That's not very fun, or whatever it is, right? You want to really set yourself up so that you have the ability to be successful on your own terms, let's say. Next question from Isabella. What type of bleach is best to use to make a basic sanitizing solution for counters and cutting boards? So, basically, Isabella, you want to use straight, regular bleach as a way to make a kind of a standard bleach solution. So, one of the things I'll say around that is you want to come in at that 150 or 200 parts per million. I'm happy to, if anyone's interested in some of those ratios, send some of those ratios. We also have a free food safety program at Rouxbe. So if you go to foodsafety.rouxbe.com, you'll have a free food safety course that we actually established for the industry just when COVID was beginning to break out in March. So if you want to go to that course, it has a lot of detail about making your own sanitizers, either through using a bleach solution or using quaternary ammonium, which is another sanitizer, or sanitizing through hot water, through the use, in the case of warewashing and things like this, through the use of very, very hot water above 180 degrees Fahrenheit. So, that's going to be an important thing. I think that in this day and age, cleaning and sanitizing couldn't be more important. So, using these sorts of best practices at home or on the job become really, really critical. Next question, can the vegetables used to prepare a clear vegetable stock be used in some way? It seems wasteful to throw them out. So, Choi, when you simmer those veggies or pressure cook those veggies, you're going to get somewhere between, say, 60 or 70% and maybe 80 or 90% of all the flavor and all the nutrients out of those vegetables. So it's almost like the vegetables have done their job by the time you get to them. And there are certainly things you can do. I think people have made little fillings and little kind of minced fillings for pasta, or layering inside like a lasagna or things like this where you have some vegetable matter that creates some texture. Me, for myself, I find that vegetable matter to be just so lacking in flavor that I have to do so much to it to doctor it up to want to eat it, that I really find that if I get a good extraction from my stock making, that at that point I feel pretty good about composting that or using it in some other way. Putting it in the garden as compost is a great way. Yeah, if you want to do some pureeing, if that's going to add some body to something, that's great, but don't expect it to add a whole lot of flavor by that point. Next question here: do you cook at home each night, or do you have it had it with food by the end of the day? I have not had it with food by the end of the day. I am excited to still cook most days of the week. I do still a lot of batch cooking on weekends and even batch cooking during the week, but I have been very fortunate in my life to have found something that gives me a lot of pleasure and a lot of fulfillment and satisfaction, but also that I've been able to make a career from. So yeah, there's certain days and certain times I don't particularly feel like cooking, but those days are few and far between. And oftentimes I look at, for myself, the process of cooking as being just a big exhale, a big kind of sigh of relief. I get to engage my senses. I get to touch food, smell food, taste food. I get to be quiet. It's really, really great. It's something that I can do from start to finish and feel just a lot of satisfaction, whether it's a 5-minute cooking activity or a 5-hour cooking activity. For me, it's fun. So that's, I think the big difference for a lot of people. It takes a lot for me to feel burned out on cooking. So I still get that pleasure of working on it, nearly every day. Speaking of stock, how do you make your liquid stock into a dry powder form? So, Holly, if you have a vegetable stock that you've made that's a liquid, you can't really turn that into a powder. What you could do is turn that into a concentrate. So you can take a gallon and make it a cup or make it a quart or this sort of a thing. What I'll suggest in terms of, if you're thinking about like a stock and powder applications, if you were to take just vegetables, carrots, onions, celery, and you were to grind those up, you could dehydrate that and make essentially, vegetable powders that you can then rehydrate in water and make kind of a stock that way. But I wouldn't go the opposite direction. I wouldn't make the liquid and then try to make a powder out of that. You don't have enough solids or anything in there to make a powder from at that point. So you'd be pretty frustrated. I wanted to make vegan gummy worms. What would you suggest to help to make the ingredients gel? So Laura, good question. I'm not sure exactly what you could use. I know that there are a lot of different things that will definitely help keep it together. Very, very tight agar, or maybe agar plus some other starches might be something that you can use. But if you were to do a quick Google search for, vegan gelatin or something similar to that, I think you get a lot of good options. But I'd probably start with some kind of a seaweed derivative like agar, and start with gummies that didn't have anything with enzymes like bromelain or anything too acidic, because those might interfere with that gelling action. So I might stay away from kiwi or pineapple or star fruit. Those are some foods that contain, bromelain or papain, like papaya contains. Those are just enzymes that inhibit that gelling that you might be looking for. But otherwise, if you did a search for vegan gelatin candy making, you might get some really, really great options. Stephanie says, hi, I haven't been able to find Balsamico Tradicional de Reggio anywhere that was recommended in a roadmap class. Any recommendations? Just any fine balsamic would do. A 5 or 10 year would do just fine. Those are more and more common at specialty markets. Higher end food markets certainly would have it. Even a lot of natural food stores would have it. So if you just ask the store clerk, the store attendant, what are some options here for some quality aged balsamic? That's going to give you a good basis to start with. Next question: if you can't eat tomatoes, allergies, what can you substitute? I wouldn't substitute anything for tomatoes. I would just find lots of other things to eat. There are so many other vegetables that if you can't do tomatoes, just find something else. There's a lot of other great things to eat out there. As delicious as tomatoes are, There are lots and lots of other things out there to eat in the world. Next question here. I have a gluten, dairy, egg, and corn allergies. I have not been able to find a recipe for really good pizza dough or bread. Any suggestions for getting the right consistency for each of these? Oh gosh, well, Dorothy, first of all, we have a lot of students who work with us at Rouxbe who have allergies or medical prohibitions or other sorts of things that really will help guide or dictate the diet. So I would say that, certain things you can do in terms of like a pizza dough, you're going to have a lot more luck, I would say, on something like a pizza dough or a flatbread when you're gluten-free than you would like a proper raised loaf, something that looks and feels like a loaf of bread, only because the leavening and the structure and the kind of the way that, in a gluten-containing recipe, the way that would cook would be just a little bit different. So I think if you want to think about, what are those things you can do to make a awesome flatbread or awesome pizza dough and leave it in that category, that's going to give you better options than if you do like a gluten-free bread or something like that. So let's just start there. I think that using a dough that combines some starches and also things like sorghum flour or a variety of rice flours might be your best bet, your best starting point. Which appliance would be used more in the vegan cooking, Instant Pot or air fryer? For me, it's the Instant Pot. I can do a lot of the things that I would do in the air fryer in a hot convection oven. Next question. I've always cooked rice on my stovetop. My wife just got an automatic rice zojirushi. She really likes it. It makes good rice, but I still prefer the old-fashioned way. Thoughts? John, I like cooking it both ways. If you've got a great rice cooker, that can save you some time or some extra thinking. But I still cook rice on the stovetop too, most of the time. I still enjoy that process myself. So there's no harm in that as long as you feel confident. And our last question here, we are remodeling our kitchen. The hot plate I'm using doesn't get my pan hot enough to reach the mercury ball stage. Do induction, butane, or kerosene portable cooktops have enough power to heat up pans adequately while I wait for my stove? I would say, Linda, absolutely induction will work. I can't speak to the butane. Kerosene I'd probably stay away from just for safety reasons, but certainly an induction, inexpensive induction cooktop will get your pan plenty hot. I have used $150 induction cooktop just for cooking demonstrations and things where I was very, very blown away how quickly that pan got too hot for me to use. So that will absolutely work. Just want to make sure you have induction ready pans, meaning heavier magnetized stainless steel pans. Any good quality pan should be induction ready, and it's something super easy to check for. So Linda, hopefully that helps you there. Well, that does it for all the questions today. Thank you all again for joining. This was a really fun session for me. Glad we got all those questions in. If I didn't get to your question, or if you've got a follow-up question, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always happy to help. And until next time, we look forward to seeing you in class, and happy cooking. Take care.